welcome students, teachers, and the generally curious to our 8th episode of the fall of 2022 season of the Constitution of American Life with the Friends of Publius. For those of you who watch us frequently, some of you teachers and possibly some of the students, the first thing you might notice is that I'm the only one that does laundry, because it seems like the other three are wearing the same clothes they were wearing last week. So that says something about, I don't know what it says anything about, but I observed that there.
David,
I will say
do
that
you do laundry or does your wife do laundry?
I do. No, I do my own laundry. I do the vacuuming, dusting. We made a marital contract nearly 40 years ago. She would do most of the outdoor work. I would do the indoor work there. I cook a couple times, although my menu is very limited there, Mr. Kavanaugh. Right now, we're both retired, so she's into remodeling. I'm painting the ceiling, and I'll be honest, my shoulders are killing me today with that.
All right, Michelangelo.
Yeah, I don't think she wants my stick people designs on the ceiling of the living room. I really don't. So I will say that we live, if not in exciting times, but very interesting times with regards to civic and constitutional life in America. Not a day goes by that we don't have an old question recycled for our times, or a new question that Americans have never discussed when it comes to our constitutions and the laws that we live under. In today's session, students and teachers, we are going to be addressing one of the most famous quotes from the constitutional framing period, coming out of the Philadelphia Convention to some degree, delivered by Benjamin Franklin. When asked what kind of government the delegates had created, Franklin responded with, "A republic if you can keep it." For me personally, this issue is extremely topical because there are many voices who are screaming from the mountaintop, proclaiming that our republic is increasingly in danger. This week, in my preparation for today's segment, I came across a very respectable poll that brings clarity to these warnings. In this poll, 81% of Democrats and 79% of Republicans believe the opposing party will destroy America. This begs the question of whether or not our Republican form of government can survive in such a politically divided culture that seems to exist today. So we hope to address the current challenge as well as provide some historical and philosophical framework to the question of Republican government. What is a republic? What characteristics should representatives and their constituents possess in order for a republic to survive? Is there such a thing as a national common good in the 21st century? And finally, do our schools have a responsibility to prepare the young for citizenship in the 21st century? So let's begin our discussion with the well-respected legend of the state of Wisconsin, Professor Tim Moore. Tim, the concept of a political republic has been around for ages, from classical civilization to Renaissance Italy, moving into the 17th and 18th century age of enlightenment. In what ways, if any, did the American Republic of the late 18th century deviate from previous understandings of Republican government?
Well, I think the founding period wrestled with whether to live with a legacy of republicanism being informed by and fundamentally based upon virtue. I think if the American Republic is different, it would be in the sense that there was an argument, and Madison made it in Fed 10, that we might be able to get by and get the common good done without virtuous people. He wanted smart, the elites to be in representative positions, but there's an argument to be made that Madison's settlement about the size of the country and whether we could have mutually agreed upon virtues in a country this size, because Sentinel, Brutus, and Cato and others said that it's too diverse for us to have these shared values, and so So they couldn't see it happening. So I would say that the distinction, the difference in the American version of the Republic is we are willing to not rely on, and Madison says this, we can't rely on virtue anymore to guide us in our political arrangements. So I think, and since we still wrestle with, do we need virtuous leaders? And then we argue about which virtues, whether they're moral virtues or constitutional virtues. So I think the American experiment is an exercise in seeing, can we, to some degree, separate the insistence that values and virtues are fundamental to good Republican government.
So the structure of our Republican government, the general design is pretty much consistent with republicanism going back to the ancients, throughout history.
Well, we have the structures. We just are less willing to insist that everybody had shared values. I mean, and that's his argument, that factions will butt up against other factions, and in this representative process, there's going to be a lot of rattle and hum. But on the back end, I mean, the argument may be this: before the American experiment, virtue was a prerequisite for government service, whereas now we're kind of and so therefore representatives could virtuously consider the common good before they went into the process. Whereas now, I think with the implications of Madison's factions is everybody's self-interested. Doesn't sound particularly virtuous, but they're going to butt up against other people's desires and wishes, and they're going to have to reach a consensus. And so the common good is like after the fact. The virtue of the process is seen after the fact, not a requirement on the front end. I don't know if that helps.
Well, let me ask you this way. If you take a 16th century thinker, philosopher on Republican government and transport them to 1800 and they observe the American Republic, would they say, this is a republic?
No, and that was the anti-federalist argument. Their argument was, Madison, don't, show us. This has never happened anywhere. Why do you think we can pull it off? So they're tapping into those old definitions of virtue being requisite for Republican government, and that's why they insisted at a small scale. Ultimately, a lot of debate in the ratification is whether Montesquieu was right or not in terms of the scale, the size of the country. Did it, and you had this 3-nation movement, and so I think a lot of the ratification in Montesquieu is the most referenced person, both by Federalists and anti-Federalists, in their discussions about Republican government. What did it mean, and what did you need to have Republican government?
Well, Professor Kavanaugh, Professor Moore kind of sets this up and gives us a framework here in identifying that one of the key principles, at least in the 18th century notion of Republican government, is this idea of civic virtue. Now, it seems to me, and I don't know if I'm disagreeing with Mr. Moore, but it does seem to me that the framers were conflicted about this reliance on virtue. There's, that is at least in the notion, well, I'll just leave it there. It seems to me that there's a conflict within themselves about this notion of virtue. How did the framers view civic virtue as they designed our republic? Do you agree with Professor Moore that they just said it doesn't exist? The people are not virtuous. We cannot rely on it.
No, I think they believed the civic virtue existed. I think there's evidence in their writings. But I'm going to go back to, I'm going to go back. I'm going to kind of address what Tim was talking about. I would also tell students to check out Fed 14 and Fed 39, because therein Madison is jumping into these definitions of a republic. And he's arguing the fact that, yeah, you guys are, channeling your Montesquieu kind of thing, and you're looking back at these ancient republics, but let's face it, they're aristocracies. Some of them are actually democracies. So he's clarifying those arguments in Federalist 14 and Fed 39, and he's really challenging the common political notion about republics at the time, and that we are creating a new style style of republic here that can expand. We can expand the sphere to go back to Fed 10. So, I think Madison in those two essays were challenging like every writer from Plato to Montesquieu in terms of what we meant by republicanism. Because let's take a look at what you anti-liberal talking about. In Venice, if we will, or going back to Greece or Rome, modern and to them modern and even republics in antiquity. Now, going back to your question, David, did the framers and founders believe that civic virtue was a real thing? Is that your question?
No, did they say it? That it, by the late 18th century, that the people themselves don't possess the virtues, so therefore you cannot rely on it.
I would disagree with that. I think all you have to do is start looking at some of the documents. You look at, holy cow, look at the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. There's stuff in there about virtue. Look at the Virginia Declaration of Rights by George Mason, alluding to the idea of virtue being a necessity, right? So we need to protect this virtue. I'll share in the resources some stuff that James Madison was writing about virtue and how that virtue, and I don't want to put the cart before the horse, but the importance of education to help create virtuous citizens. So I think they believed it was legitimate.
Well, I guess, this is my own, my own challenge or my own state of confusion. Professor Moore seemed to imply that, they had to enlarge that one justification to create a large republic was the lack of virtue. And the only way to control faction was to multiply the factions. And that is, faction exists, if I'm correct, out of the absence of virtue. It's self-interest, as Professor Moore say. So I agree with you that in a lot of literature, there's this reference to virtue, but it seems to me to be platitudes. It's all platitudes, like the word patriotism and patriot in our time. There's a lot of people who, claim to be patriots and love patriotism and love America that are doing everything to hurt it. So it's platitudes. Am I misreading the both of you?
Well, I'll just use Washington as an example, right? So here's Washington, who makes a big deal of walking away from power twice, right? The American Cincinnatus. So he makes a big deal like, okay, I've given up the command of the army, and now they want me. They're trying to. It's like, I get out and they're trying to drag me back in. It's like the mafia, right? So I've given up command of the army. I want to go back to my farm or my plantation in Virginia, and now they want me to go to this convention thing, right? Should I go? Should I not go? That kind of thing. So the idea that, Washington was very concerned about his public image of being a virtuous leader, right? So not only was he talking the talk, he was trying to walk the walk. So I do think this was a legitimate thing for these guys. But there is the reality. There is the reality of things that people are self-interested.
So Tim, is my confusion just the state of my own being?
Chris is exactly right. There is a lot of discussion about virtue. My cynical side is that a lot of the folks that are writing about the need for virtue, they're saying that we're the only ones that possess those virtues. So I think there's some degree of self-dealing on that. But I guess I'm just emphasizing the notion that we can't solely rely on virtuous people or virtuous leaders. And I think the system is designed to beat down. The process itself takes care of virtueless people and virtueless representatives. We don't have to rely on it. Is it necessary? It'd be nice. But I think the system essentially is saying we don't need to rely on it. And that's, to me, the big break in the American experiment in republicanism.
Well, Dr. Williams, let's bring you into this discussion. Again, this is a challenge for me because, one, the immense discussion about virtue, one in the We the People text, but in the writings of the 18th century as well. And if not the people, it does seem to me, Mike, that the framers were hoping that representatives would have a certain modicum of virtue there. And in fact, they expected more virtue the higher the office you held there, that they expected senators to have more virtue than members of the House, and they expected the executive to have more virtue than the members of the Senate. And Chris has referred to the American Cincinnatus, George Washington there. But to me, that somewhat becomes a design flaw, especially in the executive branch, this belief in the virtue, or that people chosen for that branch, the presidency, would possess a certain amount of virtue. And I guess it leads to the whole notion of accountability there. I see that my sense is we have a lack of accountability because we do believe that these representatives are going to have virtue, and that's a design flaw, and it's led to a lot of trouble. Where are you on that? You think I'm nuts or misreading so much here?
Okay, can I just answer your question then?
Yeah.
Okay.
Please.
I would say I don't think it's a design flaw, but can I go back to something Tim said and then kind of backtrack? Okay. So
we're always free flowing.
I agree with what Tim's saying. Like, I agree with Tim's interpretation of that. The framers were thinking, okay, we're not going to have virtuous leaders. We need to create checks and balances to create, checks on ambition. But there's some, to use Tim's term, some squishiness in terms of what virtue means and what cultural shared values means to me. So my understanding of virtue is that thinking beyond your own self-interest or the interest of your group, and to think about what is good for the entire country, right? That's the way I think of virtue. That's one thing the framers were thinking about. But in responding to Montesquieu, they were also responding to the fact that we were a very diverse country in terms of we weren't homogeneous, and most republics were small and homogeneous. So can there be a common good in a place where there is multiple cultural values at work? I think so. I think those are two different issues that the framers are trying to think through. The lack of shared values, and then maybe the lack of just, our framers were so pragmatic, right? They looked at history and they're like, look, there's not a lot of people actually being virtuous. They're using virtue as a way to get power, the claim of virtue maybe. So the design of the system was to create checks between the elites to make sure that ambition would counteract ambition. And it was also to give a voice to the people through the elections for the House, through the state representatives, through the Electoral College, right? Initially, there wasn't direct elections for senators. I don't think that's a design flaw. I think to the extent that we see a lack of what you would call accountability in the system, it's because the people do not do what they're meant to do, their side of the machine, in keeping elected leaders accountable, both at election time and non-election time. And then also, as we've talked about in previous sessions, there's a lack of sort of, institutional pride, right? The Senate, whether you're a Republican or Democrat, is meant to be jealous of their power vis-a-vis the executive branch. But what we've seen the last 3 decades is much more partisan alliances than institutional alliances. I don't think that's a design flaw. I think it's an operator, as Chris would like to say. It's an operator failure rather than a design flaw.
But see, to me, that's in some ways that's the absence of the amount of virtue that they were hoping representatives would have. And as you said, this allegiance to the institution rather than to provincial or personal interests, this allegiance to the institution was the way that we were going to have accountability. And the breakdown, especially if I look at the antebellum period, the 1850s, and if I look at it today, I mean, to me, and it shocks me sometimes when I say this, probably the best example of virtue in this last few years is Miss Cheney from the great state of Wyoming. You know, thinking about her institutional and responsibilities there, and not her party interests, her personal interests, because she sacrificed in some degree both of those. So do you understand where I'm coming from? Is, to me, that institutional loyalty is in fact an element of virtue, and the breakdown of that when we start to get partisan regional interests above national interests, especially in the Senate and the executive, then we are facing in many ways a constitutional crisis.
I just don't think the framers believed that there was a thing virtue that was like findable. Like the virtue would come out of the fact is the end product of these different factions going at each other. The common good, the thinking was the common good comes out of that. Now we can debate whether the common good comes out of it.
Right.
But so for me, it's like, what did you just say? Like, I think there's a way.
Again, and you see the phrase they use is ambition must be made to counteract ambition.
Right.
All right. And we've talked about that in that same Federalist paper is the notion that, you know, you will be loyal, as you said, to your institution. You are a member of the House and your personal interests are attached to the House of Representatives. So you will protect the House, and senators will protect the Senate, and the president will protect the executive branch. And in the battle between those, but that loyalty to the branch to me is a certain level of you know, I'm not talking to the whole branch. I'm not talking to the party. Today we've talked about this numerous times. Every member of the Senate, it seems, is loyal to their party, not to the institution of the Senate. And so whether the word is ambition, but remember, you know, I think before they get, you know, or it's in the same paragraph of Federalist paper number 51, is the idea is that the personal interest had to be attached to the loyalty to their branch. Am I correct there, Professor Kavanaugh?
That's exactly what Madison was saying in Fed 51. I think part of it too is we have to remember, because, you know, Tim alluded to Fed 10. You know, here's Madison, how, you know, and this is again the nature of Republican government. And the biggest one of the big anti-federal fears is that we're too big, we're too diverse. We cannot have a republic over a country as large and diverse as ours, right? We can't walk across our country in a day. Was that Aristotle? I think that said a good republic is one you can walk across. So we can't do that. So you also students have to remember too, Fed 10 is, you know, even though AP government loves Fed 10 because we're talking about factions, but you also got to remember that part of that too is propaganda, right? Part of this is the idea, how can we sell this to people that, you know, we're going to try something different here, and it flies in the face of all this thinking that people have been led to believe about republics. So part of Fed 10 is, well, we're going to expand the sphere, taking a multiplicity of ideas. And I look for it, but I couldn't find it. Jack Rakoff, the Stanford historian that we've alluded to on this program, had a great piece. Well, let's take a look at the members of the first Congress. Who was in the first Congress when we expanded the sphere? And it wasn't this, you know, the cream of the crop. Now, some of them were very good, but not all of them were all that good. So take Fed 10 and all the Federalist Papers with a grain of salt. Part of the reason for the writing of them is to assuage the fears and promote ratification. Go ahead, Tim. I see you want to jump in there, buddy.
Well, maybe it's because I spent a fair amount of time studying geography too, but I wanted to push back a little bit on David. I guess as I read Fed 10, I don't see a whole lot of institutional discussion. I see him really dealing with geography. And I mean, later on, the way I read Federalist Papers, we get to the details of how these factions would operate within the institutions and the structure itself. But the essential problem, I think, in Fed 10 is geography. And geography, instead of being a divisive thing, he has to make the argument that geography is a unifying thing. And the way to do that is that geography expands factions. So I see Fed 10 really in geographic terms more than anything And I think the naivete of Madison, assuming that geography would create all these equal factions, I think that's an arguable point whether Madison was right or not. But at the time, I think he's addressing geography, and factions are going to pop up out of self-interest in a vast geographic place like America.
That's why
Well,
I direct the students to Fed 14 and Fed 39 for his discussion on Republican governments.
Yep.
I think that's probably
Yep.
a little bit better than Fed 10.
Yeah, you might want to take some chill pills, students, if you're going to read Federalist 39, because it will definitely give you a headache.
Well, I think the whole essay is a chill pill because you'll be asleep in a matter of minutes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, good point. Good point. So I guess I got to ask this: what did Franklin mean then? A republic, if you can keep it. What's he referring to, and what is it that he's trying to possibly warn this gentleman of? And that's to all of you, whoever wants to jump in.
Well, first of all, this has been quoted so often. I've heard different versions of it because, it was a republic, madam. That madam was thrown in there, if you can keep it, right? I've never heard the question posed like, is it a republic or a monarchy kind of thing? So I think there are different variations. And who do we have to thank for this quote? Is that Franklin himself?
I'm sure it could be apocrypha. I don't know. It's in the question.
Right.
And,
so I didn't follow the link in the question because, if we were relying on Franklin for this quote, who knows? But I think
it's from a dictionary of quotations requested from the Congressional Research Service.
Right. So, I know between the four of us, we've heard this quote in different variations through the years, many, many, many times. But I'm thinking, well, I think we got Franklin to thank for it. So I'm going to take a little bit with a grain of salt, knowing Franklin's advanced years at the time.
Right. Well, let's deal with the spirit then.
I'm sorry.
Let's deal with the spirit.
The spirit of it is,
what does he mean?
Because they're so used to, in so many places, one, a direct democracy. We're talking about the old New England town hall meetings. There was a very, very much a democratic process at play here. And, and as we already said in numerous programs, there was a fear of an outbreak of democracy. You look at Shays' Rebellion, look at different things that were going on in the states that are going to lead to the convention itself, right? Too much democracy. Woody Holden's great book, Unruly Americans, I think he alludes to that. So I think that this is a whole idea of we're going to give you a representative government, right, madam, if you guys can keep it.
Yeah, and I think that's the important part of his quote, or the alleged quote. If you can keep it, I think what he's getting at is, a bunch of hoity-toities can gather in Philadelphia and talk about this for a whole summer. But the reality is, okay, we've come up with this plan, but it's largely on you folks. And that may be Franklin's way of saying that people do require virtue for this republic to run. So I think to not miss the, and to Chris's point, he juxtaposes it with a monarchy where there's no people input in that. So I think his insistence that there's a people input into the republic is an important thing to note, that it's up to you folks, not just us here at Philadelphia this summer.
Your perspective, Dr. Williams?
Yeah, no, I was thinking the same thing. That in terms of, it's what Tim mentioned earlier, I think of, maybe it wasn't earlier this broadcast, but what's on paper versus what's actually happening. I think it's also important for the students to understand the political and social context of the time. Like, much of America had been militarized and at war for almost a decade by the time they leave Philadelphia, right? We have the Revolutionary War starting in the mid-70s. We have it going through 1783. Then we have a series of different rebellions happening. This is like we are a society coming out of like a violent period of history. And these bright people have gotten together and come up with a structure to sort of keep the promise. Like if we go back to Paine's argument, right? That this is about liberty and this is about a new culture and a new stuff. Okay, we've given you a structure that's unique to humankind of how this can work, but you have a role to play in it. And if you don't play that role, everything we put on paper is not going to matter. So I'm just echoing what Tim said.
Well, it seems to me, Professor Moore, that this may be the wrong word, but that the radical nature of the American Constitution is that we're going to create a national republic, because as Chris has referred to, you have referred to, they're used to Republican government at the state level. They're used to more democratic form of government at the local level there. But the radical element here is that we're going to create a national republic and try to create a national identity to some degree. And as the students learn in Unit 1, the purpose of a Republican government is to promote the common good. And so I guess the great challenge is in the framework that they establish and in the justifications or the propaganda, as Professor Kavanaugh mentions, of the Federalist Papers. Madison tries to convince us that we can find a common good in a large and diverse nation. How do you think we've done? What is that a flaw? Was that a failure? The idea that we could control, faction?
Well, I mean, I would argue that the framing of the Constitution, there were two things that were factored into what needed to be represented. People needed to be represented and states needed to be represented. Now, we can argue whether the virtues of states needing representation, that's a different discussion, but those two entities drove the representation discussions. So, elected officials constitutionally have an obligation whenever they're making decisions. Am I perpetuating people's representation, or am I representing states' representational interests? So, I look at the democratization of the Senate by making it a popular vote and no longer a creature of states. So I think that fundamentally changed the nature of our republic, because the state is less representative if those senators no longer are a creature of the state.
Well,
so,
Tim, I'm sorry, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was going to push back a little bit because the senators do reflect the popular will of the people, because the popular will of the people will determine the state legislature. They're in a virtuous society. You expect,
but only indirectly, I would say. I mean,
well,
you're right.
It's much like we argue in what the kids are taught about the court, right? Right. The court is, the people have a say by who they vote for. And I think on a previous episode, we talked about that, right? The idea that, people mobilize to control elections because they want to control the judiciary. So people can mobilize to control the state legislature, therein knowing the state legislature will determine that senator. So I just might saying that there's a sense of democratic nature to the Senate as originally designed as well.
But to answer David's question directly, I don't think we've done very well at representing people's interests. I mean, how in the heck can we justify narrowing elections? How can we justify eliminating voters, popular inputs? How can we justify that? That is not representational interests of the people if we are narrowing it or gerrymandering it for that matter. So I would say we're not doing real well at representing the people. Arguably, if I'm not sure we did a great job at the founding too, if it was elitist in nature. But you would think after 240 years, we'd have got a little bit better at representing the interests of the people. I see it as actually narrowing the interests of the people in the last, in recent years.
I kind of see it as 2 steps forward and 1 step back as far as a historical, because this is, obviously in the 1850s, we lost any sense of a national common good.
Right.
We could argue, as you said in the previous statement, that in the Gilded Age, there was no sense of a popular national good being represented in our institutions of government. And, periodically, I think we lose a sense of that. And as we said before, it kind of boils up there. Yeah, Chris?
Well, I think that, I used to pose this question to my students: how do we determine the common good in a nation so large and as diverse as ours? And this is what I think Madison was trying to address as well in his different writings, and as well as other framers as well. But, my easy answer had always been elections. We have elections. But in addition to elections, we still also have to have an understanding that there will be minority rights that need to be protected. And I think this is going back to Madison and Fed 10 in terms of factions, because when he's talking about factions, he's talking really about political factions and not necessarily skin color or ethnicity or gender, because I don't think those are things that he had really considered much. So the idea is, how do we determine the common good as large and as diverse as ours? We have elections, and we determine who goes to the House of Representatives. We determine who goes to the Senate. At some point, we may actually determine who goes to the presidency. And then you have to understand that there are diverse people, and you hope that they would work towards compromise. And also, we have an independent judiciary, allegedly, that is there to maybe protect minority rights against majority tyranny. They serve as that backstop. Sometimes. But well, Chris, that's in my perfect ideal world. So
right. Well, two things. One, elections, yes, are important, but it's also dependent upon how that voice of the people is distributed in the system. So I think we're all aware of the flaws in the current structure of the system, that it's not reflecting in many cases the popular will of the people because of some design structures there. And
David, it's not the design structure. Again, I'm going to go back to operator error.
The design structure allows the House to gerrymander, allows the states to gerrymander. That's a design flaw. All right. Now that is a design flaw, that they didn't give more specific directions on how to do that. And I'm imposing.
Wait. I don't think it's a design flaw for the late 18th century, because at the time they're going to have to delegate some of those jobs to the local communities, because folks at the national capital aren't going to know that. So I think there's a good argument just for efficiency at the time. Now, it might be irrelevant now. I agree with that.
Yeah, and I tried to check myself there. I knew you were gonna be all over me like stink on poop.
I'm gonna channel a little William Shakespeare here, and with his play about Julius Caesar, and he's got a great line. He says, "The fault there, Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves." Yeah. So you're right, David. The design as a way it is running right now, does that allow people to gerrymander districts? Absolutely. Does it allow big money to come in and control elections? Absolutely. But again, that's on us.
Chris, we have seen an explosion in voter participation in the last two elections, 2018 and 2020. Right now, they're looking at numbers that might beat 2018 and 2020 as far as early vote. So the people are out there voting, but it is not a remedy, all right, to the challenge of Republican government. I'll be quite honest. In fact, this may be one of the last elections we see, in my humble opinion. Professor Williams, once again, being the courteous and kind gentleman you are, you've stayed silent on this. Any thoughts?
I don't know. No.
I have one.
My time with Tim.
I'm going to take this in a totally different direction. Montesquieu, he's most known for this geographic exploration of what republics were, but in another part of Spirit of the Laws, he talks about good republics are business. There's a commercialness. And he actually used the word soft republic, as long as there's good business. I guess he must have been channeling his inner Calvin Coolidge. The business of America is business. I mean, I guess to summarize, Montesquieu is like, if money's green, and so that'll ameliorate a lot of fighting if people are willing to engage in commerce. I mean, there's this long dissertation on people that trade and have mutual interests in getting each other's stuff. They don't beat each other up and fight. So another piece of republicanism for Montesquieu, in a way, it kind of undermines his small geographic argument in a different part of the spirit of the laws. But he makes, and Adams picks up on it too, in the defense of American constitutions, that commerce could be the glue that unifies a large republic. And so therefore the implication would be the government should kind of get out of the way of business. And I think Republicans have made that kind of their dogma for, I think going back to the 20s, maybe even to the Gilded Age, has been a Republican strain. But I think there's something to that historically, that large republics, if they're commercial, might succeed.
And so it seems to me that that's kind of been recycled in the modern era with international trade. Now,
Sure.
International trade will create better connectivity and
Yep.
codependence, and that'll stop wars, that kind of stuff.
Oops.
That reminds me of a state hearing with a judge we had in Indiana who is no longer with us, and was involved in the program for a long time. I don't want to use his name, but he was a tough judge. I mean, he was a really tough judge, kind of like a hanging judge. And
Loved him. Loved him.
He carried a copy of the Northwest Ordinance with him. So I know that Nathan Dane wrote the Northwest Ordinance because that was. But anyway, he asked my students one time at a state competition, and this is when Baghdad in Iraq was on fire. For the students listening to this broadcast, there was a period of time after we took our troops out of Afghanistan, moved them into Iraq, and there was, it was a mess for a long period of time. And he asked my students, what could solve some of this issue? And of course, my students are thinking some of these great we the people concepts about the common good, virtuous citizens, and all types of things like this. And he told them in follow-up what they really needed was banking and insurance, because this is Montesquieu. I'm listening to Tim and I'm thinking if this is Montesquieu, because if you've got a shop and that shop get blown up, but that you have insurance to recoup your losses, you're going to make that investment in your community, and they're in that business that's going to tie people together. And banking, be able to get loans to start a business, therein that will actually ameliorate some of this violence, because you're going to point out to authorities, hey, those people over there, they're the ones that are making suicide vests, and I don't want my shop or the market blown up. So it's interesting, fast forward from Montesquieu and the unity of the shilling or the pound at the time to the idea of commerce actually tying people together.
I mean, that's Hamilton's financial plan, a commercial republic.
Yeah.
Well, time has forces. We have to move on beyond Montesquieu, Shakespeare, Hamilton there. And we're going to turn maybe to a little Horace Mann and Margaret Branson. So Professor Kavanaugh,
Yes.
Public schools, and some people might argue private schools as well, clearly have a role to play in a republic. As a civic educator for nearly 40 years, what do you see as that role of schools?
I would agree. Absolutely. And I think you go back, I think I mentioned the Northwest Ordinance, providing for schools. And if you look at the reasoning for that, the idea that it's important to do that. So in our nation's history, education has been important, because if you're going to require people, and going back to the previous discussion, it's a democratic republic. We have a democratic republic, a federal democratic republic. So people do have the ability to participate in that. If you're gonna give people a requirement to participate in this, we've got to educate them to make them better informed. You don't take it from them. Madison said that you don't take it from them, you enlighten them, and you do that through public education. I'm gonna share with you. I'm going to share with you one paragraph, and I'm going to put this in the resources as to one of my favorite speeches from John Patrick, who was one of the godfathers of this program. So I'm going to read this, so bear with me. Pluribus and unum in tandem are desirable attributes of democracy in America. Both unity and diversity in concert are defining attributes of our American character, but without a common education for citizenship, which builds a comprehensive American civic identity, there cannot be the cohesive civic culture necessary to the continuation and improvement of our constitutional order. That to me is just such a powerful paragraph in terms of the importance of educating the public. And that's a role I think that all of us have played. We've all played that role as being civic educators.
You raised Horace Mann, and I think it's interesting to note that in his plan for Massachusetts public schools, he makes it. There's two things that have always struck me about his presentation to the legislature. Number one, he says, "Look, we need an educated populace," and he makes a commercial argument because education equals, people have jobs, and so he's kind of arguing this commercial republic within Massachusetts. But he also sets up this, because if people wind up in poverty, they're prone to be ruled by tyrants. So he makes this education argument being connected to avoid tyranny. But he also makes this argument, he's got this two-tiered plan. There are schools for cities and there are schools for rural parts in Massachusetts. And the curriculums are different, the school year is different, the course of study is different. So there's all kinds of economic implications in Horace Mann's proposal for Massachusetts, both in a political theory level, but also in a very economic level. So I think you're right to mention Horace Mann is worth thinking about on this question of republic, if you can keep it.
Well, can I just ask for clarification, Tim? I agree with you, and I think that's, as we move forward, we want to talk a little bit about that on, this rural urban kind of thing. But didn't Mann advocate one thing in common, and that is civic education?
Oh yes, yeah, everybody needed that.
Right.
But he also realized that there were differences within the state of Massachusetts itself. And another person on this common language, common unity is Noah Webster. I would urge students to really kind of look at Noah Webster in his efforts to standardize us culturally, linguistically, even in the matter of spelling and pronunciations. And in his first dictionary, he had these virtuous. He would use all these words as moral instructions. He'd use a word, and George Washington demonstrated virtue. So he'd define the word, and then he'd have a little, kind of a McGuffey reader thing about getting that in. So Horace Mann, I'm glad you mentioned it because I didn't think about him before. But also Noah Webster, I think, is important in can we be a republic, a unity within this large place?
Well, Professor Williams, I know you're not quite as old as Mr. Kavanaugh, but you've been involved in civic education for a very long time and been involved in the Center for Civic Ed programs. I don't know about you, but I can't go for 1 week without coming across an article in some publication that criticizes schools for both the quantity, lack of, and quality of civic education. Do you agree with this assessment of civic education in the 21st century, that we are not teaching it enough, and we are teaching it, and if we are teaching it, we're teaching it badly? And in the course of addressing that, maybe you can identify what you see as some of the main barriers that schools face in providing effective civic education.
So yeah, I agree with that. I think I'll share some resources for the resource page on studies that have been done about the lack of civic education in the different states, and then measuring outcomes, just how little students. I mean, a lot of these outcomes are just measuring what they know, which is probably not the most important part of it, but it is a part. Much less understanding how to actually be operators within the system. So I would agree with that. Man, the reason why, now I know Chris and Tim and you all you've been much more involved with your states on these curriculum issues. I would say that the two things that come to mind is our federal system means it's been hard from the get-go to kind of decide what a national curriculum would be, if we could even have one. But even if we could have a national curriculum, we were just talking about this, right? I don't know if what we share in common, our values, seem so thin. And that once you get down into the nitty gritty of what you would teach about civics, which in my perspective is teaching about power. I mean, we're teaching students about power. And in teaching that, you have to tell stories about those who have power and those who don't have power, and what lessons do we draw from that. And I just think if it ever was going to be possible, it's less and less possible for us to decide what do we teach and how do we teach that at a time when we're so polarized and political power is what everyone's thinking about, every day.
I totally disagree.
Good.
Well, that's hyperbole. Let me push back a little, Mike, on civics equals teaching about power. What I hear, well, let me just pose this. When I hear like what's a good civics curriculum look like? A part of me thinks, well, certainly there's going to be discussions about power arrangements and branches and federalism and, and all those government things. But I have to believe you, of all people, who is deeply committed to teaching students not just about those structural things, but also about, hey, there are other people on the cosmos that maybe you need to know and get to meet. So I think a part of me recoils at civics being only about power arrangements. I think civics should have a component of I travel to an Indian reservation, or I travel to Tupelo, Mississippi, or I travel to, and foreign exchange. I mean, just these simple things. Because if we are a diverse nation, civics would have a component of get to meet your diverse nation, not just about power arrangements. So I had a visceral response that civics was just about, and maybe that's not what you intended to say. It just kind of shocked me because I know you're a person that's deeply committed to sharing other cultures and other places with your students.
Yeah, no, maybe you did miss. I mean, I wasn't talking about the power arrangements. I was thinking about something I've been reading about. Those who've been oppressed in our society, how civics education is so important to them, and that this critique was that so much of education now is about character building.
Right.
Show grit, right? Well, how do you show grit in a system that has been designed and has oppressed you for centuries? No, we should be teaching folks, this is how you wield power in the system. And this is how these are examples of how things have changed when those who have been oppressed fight back peacefully. So when you start thinking about what are those lessons, like how are you going to talk about Native American policy, I think we don't have a shared understanding about what that lesson would be. Some of us would want to say, let's teach it from the perspective of the oppressed, and some would say, no, let's teach it from a different perspective. And therefore, we just kind of come at odds at each other. That's what I meant.
Okay.
Well, it seems go ahead, Chris.
Well, I think one of the things to take into consideration, I got to steal this from one of my old colleagues, who was a very successful We the People teacher. He always used the word dispositions, right? What he talked about was not only do we arm our students with the knowledge, right, of how, back to what Mike's word, power, and how power works and how power has run roughshod over certain groups of people. But when we arm them with this information, now they're going to take some type of action, right? Not only is it's more like a Project Citizen kind of idea for the students that don't know. Project Citizen is also a program by the Center for Civic Education. So they identify a local problem and how do we solve this local problem by action. And I think that's important, the idea that good civic education arms people, but it also encourages them to take that action. And I think this is where we get into a problem these days, is because everybody has a different idea about what action that should be. And you see some states that are requiring, active students. They have to take some type of role within their community. And you've got other places that are fighting against that because they don't like that idea. So I like the idea not only of arming young students with information about, the Federalist Papers or the arguments of Philadelphia or those historical arguments that we look at, but also that disposition to take action. And therein creates the rub, I think, sometimes in society, because so many times kids will take that action and it maybe will be challenging the status quo, and people are not wanting those kids to challenge the status quo. And I would say, see Socrates.
Well, and, I wanted to build off of that, as far as the barriers, what Tim talking about Horseman and Webster and stuff, I think part of the problem that we face is I don't know if you guys agree, but I don't know if we've ever had kind of a consensus on what the purpose of schools are. Is it a commercial purpose, which I think dominates now? If you've read the latest data, the humanities and social sciences enrollment in universities is plummeting. Departments are being closed. STEM is just dominating because everybody sees education as preparation for the workforce there, and the civic mission of schools has kind of been trounced. And I know while I was state coordinator in the state of California for the Center for Civic Ed, we were facing a crisis at the elementary and middle school level that history and civics was just being dropped. The total minutes dedicated to the study of history and civics was being diminished greatly in lieu of math and science and literacy, not English as far as reading great literature, but just basic literacy there. But then so I think that's one barrier is we can't kind of carve out an understanding of what we want schools to be. And secondly, Chris, I think you pointed it out, and well, all of us have. Good civic education is a three-legged stool. It is knowledge, all right, which tends to be the primary focus, but it's also skills and it's also dispositions. And you pointed out, I think, a major barrier, and it's not just dispositions, it's also skills. All right, we're running into problems with trying to teach students skills that are necessary for good citizenship, because that means questioning authority. That means independent decision making, critical those, and we know we got governors in this country that don't want their students to do those kind of things, as well as the disposition. So I think there's money barriers, there's polarization is clearly it. That gets down to what is it that we want schools to do in the first place, and what is good civic education, and does the polarization is it going to allow for that?
I think you got it's a great question, David, but I can't help but think about all those kids in the 50s, 1950s.
Always good to clarify.
There was a tremendous push for tech ed, and schools were seen as creating workers and accountants and tiny boxes on the hillside. And all those kids 10 years later are wind up hippies reading Thoreau and pushing for all kinds of social studies changes. So I kind of take solace that if those kids who were inundated with tech ed in the 50s, there's always going to be a blowback. So I think the STEM, as much as I don't like STEM funding either, I think it'll run out of gas because kids will look back at their education and go, "What the heck? You mean there's poetry?" I mean, you can't make it a nation of engineers. So I think the 50s and how it morphed to these questionings in the 60s, we may be in the 50s right now with our education and our lack of civics too. And I think there'll be a blowback. So I'm not willing to say the sky's falling if the 50s and 60s is an example.
I'm gonna push back a little bit on that, because I think that one of my things, spending too much time on social media Twitter. And I see people, talking about this new civics program or this civics program. And I'm thinking, my goodness, the grandfather program is the Center for Civic Education and the We the People program. It's been doing it for a long time. And we already have we've got the information, thanks to Dr. Diana Owens at Georgetown, that our kids come out of the program much, much better. And so we see this because of the current state of our politics. You've seen a push for civic education, a greater push, which means more money. You want to see what a society values, where do they put their money? And so we see more money available for this. But I think the problem, and David alluded to this, is like, are we teaching 1619 project? Or are we teaching 1776?
Right.
I think therein lies one of the major throwbacks, because I think of some of the ways maybe I presented information in class, people would be aghast. Right? Because, I'm not promoting patriotism, which I'm not. I'm promoting free thinking and critical thinking, which I think helps promote patriotism. But that's my personal philosophy. But I think so you see a push now, there's money available, right? But who you're going to get this money depending on, I'm using this kind of, short term 1619 versus 1776. Right, curriculum. And I think therein lies the problem. Whose history are we going to tell, and how are we going to tell it?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, we got to bring it to an end there. But I want to say, Chris, that I do think you say I don't teach patriotism, but I think you teach what I call tough love patriotism, because I was the same way. We're not going to gush and bleed red, white, and blue in our classroom, because we want kids to be critical thinkers and hopefully form their own opinions and perspectives there, but it's still patriotism. It's not blind patriotism. It is what I call real patriotism. So in the tradition of our closings, I'd like to ask each of our FOPs here to give teachers and students some final thoughts, recommendations about how to approach Ben Franklin and the Republic, if you can keep it, and civic education. So Professor Williams?
Yeah, I would say that one thing that we haven't brought up yet is, at the time when Ben Franklin supposedly made this comment, just like who was considered to be who were citizens, and who was considered to be part of the Republic, and whose common good are we looking after? And we know that story. It's 2 steps forward and 1.5 steps back, but it's been expanding. My point is I think that the role that those who have been oppressed over time is a wonderful mirror for the students. They provide a mirror for all of us about what the Republic can stand for. I think that thinking through what it means to have a republic, we can learn a lot through the voices of Frederick Douglass and Martin Luther King and others in that ilk, right? Because they're the ones who are really forced to think about what it means to live in a place where their rights weren't being protected most of their times.
Professor Moore?
I would suggest that Franklin, if you said this, is basically being a small d Democrat. Look, folks, it's not what we do at Philadelphia. It's not on us. It's an evolutionary process that you're involved in. So the quote to me is the important part of the quote for me, and maybe this isn't right, but if you can keep it is the most important part of this quote. And I think there's an assumption of progress in the future. There's a future orientation to how this thing will play out. And I think that gets to the things that Mike has said already, that there's going to be future people that have a role in this republic, and they had a role in keeping it. It's a future-oriented statement. So I would urge students to look at those people that have played a role in defining, refining the republic. It's not just about elites.
Professor Kavanaugh?
And I would, and expanding that republic. I think that's what, Mike was alluding to. So I agree with both of my colleagues, to use we the people vernacular. I think, Tim, I love your emphasis on if you can keep it, because if for the students to consider just that phrase. So here's Franklin saying that allegedly on the streets of Philadelphia in 1787. And how has that, if you can keep it, how was the you changed? Right? Who becomes part of that you? I think that's because we've been talking about civic virtue. We've been talking about, this whole idea of that kind of thing. So how does that affect you as a student? And who have we expanded to include the you? I think that's something to consider. And I would warn you, don't get caught up in this claptrap of, and I'm trying to clean this up a little bit. Oh, are we a democracy or a republic? Oh, we're a republic. No, we are a federal democratic republic, and the framers knew this, right? They knew this. So the idea, well, we're not a democracy, we're a republic. No, we're both, and you wouldn't have elections if we weren't a democracy. So don't get caught up in that kerfuffle about, what are we, a democracy? Or I'm trying to use words that or PG, right?
So kerfuffle. Well, we'll add that to our list of.
Well, don't get apoplectic, but anyway.
No, that's in our list. But kerfuffle needs to be added.
Don't fall into that trap of that. So about this whole idea, and and again, my standard: if you believe the Democratic Republic, is in danger from a lack of civic education or a different type of civic education, how would you fix it? Have a plan.
Well, I've got nothing to add to the astute comments of my colleagues. And so we're going to bring this to a close. Hopefully in the next session, we'll see some of you. And we're going to be looking at a Unit 1 question on the first charter of Virginia and constitutional government and English common law, which I know that Professor Moore is all tingly right now that this is going to be our subject for our next discussion. Until then, peace, love, yogurt tacos. Make sure you do your laundry. Bye-bye, bye-bye.